Well, thank you. I did explain to Vic and Louise earlier that I've done loads of preparation for this meeting. As you can see, those are my notes. And I'm actually planning to talk for 20, 25 minutes, perhaps at most, and then over to you for questions, because I feel that's the best way to do this. A very quick background about me, because I always get frustrated if I don't know who's talking to me, and you've all had the decency to tell me. I was a socialist from the age of 11 in many ways, because I'm a twin. And in 1969, I passed the 11 plus and went to a grammar school, and my twin did not pass the 11 plus and went to a secondary modern school. And I saw how institutional injustice could be created. And without that experience, my life would have been different. So my womb mate, as we call each other, and I created this idea of equality, which we were going to sustain whether or not the rest of the world wanted to understand it or not. And that was a fundamental transformative experience for me. And it's always guided. Even though I wanted to be a chartered accountant, I became a chartered accountant. I knew I never believed in everything about the way in which I was taught economics. I argued with tutors all the way through my economics education. I didn't agree with the way in which accountancy was run and operated. I ran an extremely unusual firm of accountants because I began it, and at one point I was the only man amongst 15 women. Which made us a pretty odd profile of firm, which was highly successful. And so throughout my career, I've not really sought to follow rules. By the time I was in my early 40s, my partners, women, and I had all decided we'd had enough of doing that particular stage of our careers, and I knew I wanted to become a thinker-writer around issues around green and economics and tax, without quite knowing how. Took the risk, gave up a secure income because I had my first son. The obvious thing to do is give up a secure income when you have your first child. Nothing more logical to do than that. But took the risk, had another child, had even less secure income by then, but it worked. And became a co-founder of the Green New Deal, which I'm a member of the original Green New Deal group, which is a mix of Greens, Labour and non-aligned, but meant that I've worked closely with Caroline Lucas for a long time, because she was a member when she was still an MEP. In 2003, co-founded the Tax Justice Network with John Christensen, who I was introduced to by Prem Sikka. So we always call Prem a sort of the godfather of tax justice, because he put us two together. And by mistake, I mean, we didn't intend to give up our careers, our lives, our everything to tax justice, but for a long time, that's what it became. My wife once said to me, sometime around 2006, that sabbatical, which was going to be that period when you were going to sort of start exploring ideas, when does it end, and when are you going to contribute towards the cost of bringing these children up? Well, curiously, a year or so later, we really began to be paid a bit. It's been the most fascinating thing to do. I've ended up for the last 5 or 6 years as a professor of economics at City University London. I'm just leaving there at the moment, and I'm transferring to Sheffield University, where I'm going to be a professor of accounting, which is where Prem has been. And I'm also visiting professor of sustainability at Anglia Ruskin University. And I've got a title which I can't say at Copenhagen Business School because I don't speak Danish. Thankfully, they do the teaching in English there, as far as I'm concerned. So I've ended up this really weird career where I've become an academic by mistake. But my job is really to be thinker, writer, and as my sons will put it, giant shit stirrer. They sometimes say, what the hell are we meant to rebel against, Dad? Because whatever it is, you've already actually had a go at it. Thankfully, they are following in the footpath. My elder son is actually a Labour Party officer at Leeds University at the moment in the Student Society. My younger son actually has just gone to Aberystwyth, so he must be very near where Charlie and I, in fact, I was walking around Corris up near the Centre for Alternative Technology only 2 weeks ago. Had a great time walking around Corris, which is one of my favourite parts of the world. My escape is narrow gauge Welsh railways and old quarries. One has to have one's geekdom, and to avoid taxed geekdom, I do railways and quarries. I really am. Um, my role in life is to be an idea creator. That's what I've always been about. I'm not a frontline activist in a sense. I mean, there have been moments when I've been sort of given more prominence, and the Corbyn era was one. I knew Andrew Fisher, who became Jeremy's chief of staff, very well during his years at the PCS trade union. And much to my surprise, I found that quite a lot of the economic policy that was used by Jeremy to become leader of the Labour Party was in fact lifted almost straight off my blog. I've been writing my blog since 2006. For those who've never come across the blog, I normally write 3, 4 or 5 blog posts a day. I mean a day. The average is 3.5 blog posts a day, every day, for over 14 years now. That's over 17,000 blog posts. It is the way to get your name top of a Google search, but it's pretty desperate. When people say, how do we find you? I just said, just Google Richard Murphy. I will come up, but it's a pretty desperate way to achieve it. So, I mean, there are better things to do in life unless you really do have a commitment to achieving social change with tax as one of your priorities. And the Tax Research blog has obviously had that priority. But I don't restrict myself to just tax. I do talk about economics, I talk about green issues, and sometimes I just talk about slagging the Tories, which makes me popular with some of the people who give me funding and tell me off and say, you aren't allowed to do that. So I sometimes have difficulty raising money, but thankfully it's always worked. Although it did look pretty dodgy earlier this year. And then Sheffield have come along, and thankfully things look as though they'll go on to an even keel again. Modern monetary theory. I can well remember going to university in 1976. For those who are old enough to remember, it's 1976 was a fantastic summer.
Yeah, I remember it.
Incredibly hot. I remember the girlfriend. It was amazing. I had a wonderful time. I went to Southampton to study economics because my father wouldn't let me go to the LSE because it was the den of the left, and he didn't want me to get involved with left-wing politics. If he hadn't realised what I was doing already. But anyway, I wasn't allowed to go to the LSE by him. He wasn't going to pay if I went there. So I went to Southampton and got involved in student politics. There we go. Of course I did. I just didn't tell him. And he never found out, as far as I know. He died a couple of years ago. I still think he was unaware of that. And it rained every day for the first term just to mark the change from that glorious summer. I well remember that Southampton was the soggiest city on earth as far as I was concerned. But in my very first term of being taught economics, I realized that I was being taught complete and utter crap. Crap I sometimes use as a technical term. I was actually told I wasn't allowed to use it in the Scottish Parliament 2 or 3 years ago. And I said, oh yes, I am. It stands for completely rubbish approximations to the truth. And when I said it was an acronym, they let me use it, which was quite funny, really. I made it up on the spur of the moment, but I've used it regularly since, and students find it amusing in the way that they don't understand the joy of tax because they're too understand to what I am referring by the title. I have to explain to them that tax is actually the most exciting 3-letter word in the English language, ending in X, isn't it? And then they get it. But I was taught, completely standard neoclassical economics with a bit of Keynes was still taught in those days, so there was some Keynes in macroeconomics. But frankly, I absolutely thought I was taught complete rubbish. Most of the stuff I was taught at university, I argued all the way through. That is my normal modus operandi in life anyway. I really hated it. And then when it came to the finals, I wrote exactly what they wanted. I got on extremely well with my tutor, and he sent me a 1-word note after I got a quite good degree at the end of it, which was hypocrite. Because I'd answered all the questions they wanted on the finals and never had before. But, one sometimes has to compromise to get where one wants in life. I never forgot that frustration. The work that I began on my book called The Courageous State, which actually has been quite well read over the years, which includes some pretty fearsomely difficult to understand diagrams. So unless you really want to bend your mind around it, up to you. The Joy of Tax is a lot easier read. That work took 25 years to think out, how do I understand the economy for people. How do I understand the role of money? How do I understand the role of interest and its pernicious relationship with life? How do I understand what advertising is trying to do, which is to promote consumption, to enslave people in debt so that they will forever be compliant with the wishes of their employers, and therefore never rebel against the system which has literally trapped them into this cycle in which they are involved. And I spent a long time thinking about that, and in the process thought a great deal about the nature of money and how it played a role in modern in the economy, which is a question which is almost not addressed at all in most economics, and literally in conventional macroeconomics does not exist. Quite astonishingly, for example, our measure of gross domestic product has no way of building the banking sector into it, because it is presumed within macroeconomics that money has no value added. And yet we have a banking sector which is considered to be the most valuable exporter of services from the UK. And they have to overcome this by making a tack on extra. Let's assume that the banking sector adds value, even though in macroeconomic theory it doesn't. And I realized that there were all these massive contradictions, and had worked quite extensively on the nature of money in my own thinking behind the scenes, which has driven so much of the work I've done. And when I came to write The Joy of Tax, which was my 2015 book, you actually won't find any mention of the words modern monetary theory. But in practice, I described it. And it was at that point that I discovered that there were people actually writing modern monetary theory. I could fish out some more books from that lot behind me. I'm afraid that really is all economics books behind me. I mean, I wish it wasn't, but there's another bookshelf of all the interesting stuff elsewhere. But I then realized that there was this thing called modern monetary theory. And I didn't have complete agreement with it, but I've got increasingly aligned to it as modern monetary theory has become increasingly practical. And there are strands within MMT. You will find there's a strand which is Australian, run by Bill Mitchell, who is extremely resolutely left, but is also extremely inflexible, unfortunately, and actually alienates very large numbers of people because he's inclined to call people idiots if they don't agree with every word he writes. And he writes even more words than I do. And I'm known to tell people they're idiots if they turn up on my blog and say the Tories are wonderful, because that's what I tell them. You are an idiot. How can you not work out that they aren't wonderful? But I'm pretty tolerant of a wide range of opinion, that apart. There is another strand of MMT, which is very much more around what Stephanie Kelton is doing. And The Deficit Myth is a highly readable book. It's also, and I know you may well be offended by me saying this, and remember, I was one of the people who put Amazon's tax into the national arena, the international arena. I was involved in writing the story on their tax affairs, first of all. But it's available as a Kindle download for about 99p at the moment. So it's an easy way to read it if you don't want to spend more than that. But it is highly readable, and it does explain MMT and its practical applications. Not all of it. It's not meant to be complete, but it is highly readable, and it's been quite persuasive. Stephanie and I talk quite often, and we're talking very much about how can we make this work. Sometimes with pegs being applied to noses. I mean, let's be honest, I don't think Stephanie is a big fan of Joe Biden, but she is advising the Biden campaign on the basis of the alternatives available. It's a damn sight better than the other one.
Okay.
It's a low bar, maybe, but it's a damn sight better. It's not good, but it's better. And so whilst he was clearly not her first choice, which was, let's be blunt, Bernie, and she's a good friend of AOC, and I get involved with them through Stephanie, we are having to be where we are. What is a modern monetary theory? Basically, it says some very simple things. It really is not complicated. But first of all, understand it's not really very modern, and it's not really a theory, it's more a description. And so it's not as complicated as the word theory. Theory always puts people off. It isn't really a theory. It is simply a description of what happens. It's a description in particular of what has happened since August 1971. And I know I'm not the only one looking at the screen who was around in August 1971. I can tell also that at least Alex was not, but some others definitely were. And Tricky Dicky, as he was known to me at the time, because I had a text and RE teacher in 1971 who referred to Nixon as Tricky Dicky in every lesson that he could, took the world off the gold standard. And the gold standard was where the value of a currency was linked to the value of gold. And the US dollar was the last major currency that was linked to the gold standard. But again, as those of us who are old enough to remember this will know, the pound was on a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. $2.40. Imagine it, $2.40 to the pound. And until 1967, it was $2.80 when it was devalued and Roy Jenkins retired and Jim Callaghan became Chancellor because of the shame of having to devalue. You know, it gets devalued every day now, who cares? And, you know, we're down to, what, 120 or so to the dollar. But yeah, things have changed dramatically. But there was this fixed exchange rate. So de facto, we were effectively on the gold standard too, to a degree, because we had a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. So every pound literally could be, in a sense, converted, you know, if you had the equivalent of one of those in those days. And again, for those who are old enough to remember, a brown note would of course been a 10 bob note, not a 10 pound note. And that 10 bob note was probably worth more than that 10 pound note now, because that's 50p in those days. But it could have been converted theoretically into gold. Now, from August 1971 onwards, that ceased. Literally, that is worthless. And until they made them plastic, at this point in the talk, I always tore up the note in front of me. It's now a bloody sight harder to tear them up, and also a lot harder to put them back together again to convince Tesco's it was a mistake and can you please take it anyway. They always used to take my torn up notes, but now they don't. So I don't take the risk anymore. Just presume I tore that up, okay? Because that is in itself meaningless and worthless. It is just a representation of a promise to pay. And that is all money is in a fiat currency system. The trouble is almost no economist realized that we had changed. So we carried on behaving as if money had real value. And if money was in short supply because it was related to the physical quantity of gold in the world, when in practice, there is no limit to the number of these that we can, in theory, have. You can't print them. Nobody else can actually print them, including Scottish banks, even though they obviously have their own notes, because for every Scottish note that there is in existence, they must deposit an English note with the Bank of England, by the way. So their notes are literally Bank of England notes, just reprinted effectively as Scottish notes. So nobody else can create money except the Bank of England, but the amount of money that the Bank of England can produce is theoretically without limit. And that is the massive change that modern monetary theory says. And it says that we need money. And the only way in which this money actually gets value is by the government spending it into existence. Think about it. How would this have value? You know, suppose we started a new economy from scratch. It's an idea that I think about in terms of Scotland quite often. How if, and let's just presume it's Scotland or Wales, and this is entirely plausible in both cases, of course, that they create new governments with new currencies. And, you know, that's what Boris Johnson is driving them to think about. How would their money get value? The government would have to literally spend it into existence. So what modern monetary theory recognizes and says is that all money is debt. There is no other way in which money is created. The debt is between the central bank and the government, and admittedly, the government owns the central bank, but it is still recorded as a debt relationship. And the government then spends it into the economy. And it's always done this, by the way. This is how governments used to fund wars in the days when we had, you know, kings and a feudal world. They would persuade people to go and fight their war by offering them gold, and they would reclaim the value of that gold later on through taxation. Okay, that's how the coin got its currency, because they taxed to give it currency, because people had to have those coins to pay the tax. Well, you now have to have some of this to pay your tax. You cannot pay your taxes in any other currency. Yeah, you can go to the HMRC website and say, can I pay in euros? But in practice, they convert them into pounds before they settle the bill. You must actually end up paying in pounds. So what MMT says is that, first of all, money has to be spent into existence. And it gets its value because the government says, you've got to use our currency to pay your taxes. And because you've got to use their currency to pay your taxes, shopkeepers are going to expect to be paid in that currency, because they're also going to have to settle their VAT in it, and they're going to have to pay their staff in it, and they're going to have to pay their staff's PAYE in it, and so on. And that therefore means it becomes the currency in circulation. This is, by the way, why if you go to a country like where I was not so long ago, it seems like a lifetime ago, that which was only last year, the Lebanon, where the tax bill is not big enough. In practice, you can have a second currency circulating perfectly well, because nobody cares whether they use the Lebanese dollar or not, because the US dollar is actually considerably more useful, and the tax bill is so low that whether they use the Lebanese dollar or not doesn't make any difference, because they can always buy some more Lebanese dollars with US dollars. And so they have no control of their macroeconomy. We have to have enough government intervention in the economy, spending these things into existence, to actually have control of the macroeconomy, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a critical function of the state to make sure that we have the process of well-being, which delivers for all of us. I mean, I believe obviously in a welfare state. I believe in the NHS. I believe actually that a large number of services should be under state control. My father joined the Nationalised Electricity Board on the day it was nationalised, and retired on the day it was privatised, saying, not going to work for those buggers. So we had some things in common, even though he didn't want me to study politics. So, I mean, that's sort of, inherent in my thinking there. Now, what that means is, if money is effectively without limit, and we can spend as much of it into existence as we want, we do not live in a tax and spend economy, we live in a spend and tax economy.
Okay.
So throughout our lives, we've been taught we must look in the piggy bank to see if there's enough money to be able to spend. Every time a politician comes up with a good idea, we're going to do something, we must look in the piggy bank to see if there's any money. And it's always the first question a journalist asks: how are you going to pay for this?
Yeah.
The answer is, I'm going to print some money. What am I then going to do? I'm going to charge some tax, and I'll reclaim it to the extent I need to. And the extent to which you need to charge tax is that amount which prevents inflation. Now, not all inflation, because a bit of inflation is actually quite good for an economy overall. It makes people feel better. It also encourages investment. If you have deflation, people feel pretty grim, and actually deflation actually redistributes wealth upwards, and inflation redistributes wealth downwards. So a bit of inflation is good for redistribution, and a bit of deflation is very bad for concentrating wealth in the hands of literally the owners of debt rather than those who owe debt. So we want a bit of deflation, but we don't want too much inflation, because it's highly destabilizing, and it tends to penalize those on lowest incomes the most, because they actually are most stressed by immediate price increases and do not have the means to make settlement of the cost of literally living. So inflation has to be kept under control. The role of tax in a modern monetary theory economy, when we understand it correctly, is never to pay for public services, because the public services are paid for by creating more money at the Bank of England. The role of tax is to reclaim that money from the economy, to keep the total amount of activity in the economy under control without too much inflation. When do you get inflation which can be controlled in this way? When you get full employment. Until you get to full employment, you cannot get inflation which can be controlled by either monetary policy, that is changing interest rates, or fiscal policy, that is taxing more or less as appropriate. We can get inflation for other reasons. We are most certainly going to see it next January. We are going to have food price inflation of a ghastly potential next January, because Brexit's going to deliver it. person who lives 2 doors down from me, where I am in Ely in Cambridgeshire, is involved in importing food from Italy, pasta and tinned tomatoes. That's the business she's in. Her customers include people like Morrison's and Tesco's and so on. And there is no way that we'll get through Brexit without a 10% price increase on all your pasta and all your tinned tomatoes, because that's what is going to happen. Well, even if we get a deal. And as she says, it's going to be mayhem. And there are some foodstuffs which will be worse than those more basic things. So, but there's nothing that MMT or any other mechanism of equivalent type can do to control that inflation except by stopping Brexit. Now, I'm not going to go into Brexit in length here. It is why Jeremy and I did not agree with each other. Jeremy Corbyn and I did not agree with each other, and particularly John and I did not agree with each other for all sorts of reasons. I felt they did not. I mean, I'm in favour of the European Union and what it does, even though I see all the faults within some of its structures, and I recognise there are vast numbers of those as well. But it's back to one of those sort of what's the least worst rather than what's the best. And I felt that the EU was the least worst. Now, but inflation control is therefore built into modern monetary theory. But once you understand that you've actually got the ability to produce as much money as you want, the goal of the economy is not to balance the books anymore, because money is not in short supply and there is no constraint on the amount of it you may have. And instead, you are planning for full employment without creating inflation. You are suddenly looking at a totally different economic policy. Because now you're talking about putting people to work rather than keeping people out of work as the means of suppressing inflation, which is fundamentally what conventional economics does. Conventional economics uses unemployment as the means to control the money supply by forcing up interest rates to force people out of work, to reduce economic activity, to control inflation, and MMT uses tax for that purpose. Now, there are developments needed in taxation theory within MMT, and I'm working on them. I mean, I have contributed to the theory of MMT around tax, and there's another element which I'm working on now, which won't be published yet, but a theoretical development of a new tax to deal with it. And I'm probably not going to go into that tonight. But the point is that MMT lets us think entirely differently about the economy, because what it lets us say is, what do we want to achieve with the real resources that we have available to us? And in truth, that actually says the resources are twofold, because MMT has developed to realize that it's not only about full employment, but it's also about sustainable full employment, i.e. it's green. So we have to actually work in a way that delivers the investment that makes our long-term futures viable, and at the same time delivers the work that people need to be able to afford to live within this sustainable economy. And I believe that there is no other structure of economic management that we know of at the moment which can be adapted to the societies in which we do live and their overall preferences at the moment. And I'm not a revolutionary. I believe that we are better off with an adaptive process eventually, although we are going through some massive shocks on the way right now, which are doing us no harm if we take the opportunity of them. I'll always grab an opportunity when one comes, and we should be adapting like hell at the moment, which is why MMT happens to be in the right place at the right time. But what I want is to understand, what can we do with this? Now, we can, once we aren't using tax, for example, to pay for public services, we can use it to redistribute income and wealth. At this precise moment, we do not need tax increases in our economy, because what MMT makes clear is that if you take money out of the economy through charging tax, you reduce demand, and if you reduce demand, you reduce employment. We are heading for the most horrible unemployment figures come 1st November onwards. I mean, I think we're talking about 4+ million on the record unemployment by Christmas, which will actually be 5+ million real unemployment, because so many people will simply disappear from the employment market who would otherwise be in it. And I don't rule out that we could go higher than those numbers. We could be really talking about up to 6 million people not working who would be working if they had the choice by sometime early next year, because I think so many businesses are also going to go bust. We therefore don't need real tax increases at all now. We don't need to pay for coronavirus, by the way, because it has literally been paid for by money creation this year. I mean, let's be clear about it. The government's QE program is not an ideal mechanism for doing monetary theory, but it approximates to it. And so far this year, despite all the talk about the national debt going up, The real national debt, after we take into account the amount of repurchase of debt by the government through the QE program, has actually gone down. National debt is actually lower now than it was in March, even though we've run a deficit of 170 billion since then, because the government has simply printed the money in a way which modern monetary theory describes as possible to cancel the debt it's created. There are just simpler and cheaper and more effective ways of doing it than via QE, which give bankers a slice of the action on the way. And I can't see why they need a slice of the action, because I'm not terribly pro-banker, with apologies, Mick, but that just isn't my style. So we could, however, be using taxes now to really redistribute. We could have a wealth tax. We could be increasing income tax rates to actually make sure that those on the highest rates of earning are redistributing to those on the lowest incomes. And that's totally economic effective, because we want people who spend all their incomes to be spending right now, because that's the best way to stimulate demand, which is what we need to make sure people are at work. So we have to get people to work, and putting money into the hands of those with the lowest incomes is the most effective way to achieve that outcome, because they spend every penny they earn and the wealthy don't. In fact, the clue is in the fact that they're wealthy. They're wealthy because they don't spend their income. I mean, we know that. So we have to take income away from them to get it spent. We could reprice things which are obviously harmful to society, carbon and other things. We could change the way we manage things. We can provide fiscal stimulus to industries that need it, new social housing, the green economy, transport infrastructure, electric cars, all those things that we need, we could do, and we could be putting people to work to do those things in the logic of the New Deal. We're not even talking Green New Deal here. We're now going to be talking FDR style New Deal, literally putting people to work to prevent mass unemployment, which is coming our way. So you need to think about tax as a mechanism for providing those sorts of stimuluses as well. Now, MMT says all that is possible, and that we don't have to worry about this figure for total debt. Debt fixation is a curse on our society. I am working on some major work at the moment, which I think is going to be quite shocking when it comes out, because I am pretty sure that the Office for National Statistics is, or has over the last decade, got all our figures for national debt wrong and has significantly overstated it. I can't tell you why yet, but we're talking about errors of hundreds of billions of pounds in the calculation, not, you know, the odd billion or two here or there, but hundreds of billions out. And I believe the real national debt at the moment is well under £1 trillion, by the way, even though the government claims it's 2 trillion, which it's using, of course, as a reason for austerity again. So I'm working with what will almost certainly be probably a joint Guardian Channel 4 process of releasing information to show that national debt is nothing like what the ONS claim it to be, which is a political fix on their part to support the programme of austerity, when actually we simply don't need it. But if we don't need it, if we do understand debt in a different way, that it is not a constraint on our activity and that we don't need austerity, then it's beholden on us to imagine what sort of world do we want to create? What policies do we desire? How can we reorganize society? How can we meet demand? What is that demand for? How large a state do we need? What is the constraint on the size of that state? Is there a constraint on the size of that state? How much can we actually direct in these ways? And ask those questions which conventional economics tells us we can't do. And my frustration, and I've heard some of you clearly express this, and I know Keir Starmer, and I know Annalise Dodds better than I know Keir Starmer. I've worked with Annalise when she was an MEP quite a bit, because she was quite useful on tax issues when she was in Brussels to me. And we worked quite a number of occasions when she was on what was called the Taxi Committee of the European Parliament. I'm afraid they're being incredibly timid. They don't in any way accept this argument about MMT. In fact, there are, as far as I know, only 2 members of Parliament who do accept this argument, which is kind of a shame right now, when it's sort of our route to liberation in some ways, as far as I see it. And they're Caroline Lucas, who does get it. She does seem to. I don't think the Green Party do, but I think Caroline does. I don't think all the Greens do. I'm not saying it's Green Party policy by any means, but she certainly has twigged it and now understands it. She spent too long in my company. That's her problem. We do see each other fairly often. And Angus MacNeil, who is the SNP MP for the Western Isles, the most remote constituency in the UK, the only one who goes home landing on the beach on the plane, because that is the runway on the island he lives on, of Barra. Literally, he can only get home when the tide is down, because then the plane can land. And that is literally how he gets home. Although he isn't going to Westminster very much at the moment, in fairness. He gets it completely. He's a massive fan of the joy of tax, and he has held briefing sessions on modern monetary theory in Parliament. And we did get over 40 MPs to come to one. Stephanie Kelton spoke to it. I also was there, and we got over 40 MPs there, but were they convinced? I don't think most were. The narrative of constraint is so useful to the Tories. And bluntly, I think it is actually really quite useful to some in Labour still. Some in Labour think it really is useful, and it goes along with their ability to try and control too much of the economy in ways that actually I don't want them to control the economy, and which I wish they would rethink. Enough. I said I was going to talk for only a while. I've actually talked for slightly longer, but we started slightly later, perhaps than I expected. Look, we've got, I presume we're finishing at 9-ish? In which case, we've got...
on the dot. Yes.
Well, yeah, I go all night, but I mean, presuming that you lot want something else to do tonight, then we've got 41 minutes, according to the clock above my computer, for questions. And I mean, I'd much rather now develop those themes around questions than me prattling on, because I can prattle on forever.
Well, maybe if I can at least get things going, having done the talk a month ago, just looking into this, I'm very encouraged by the fact that you describe this as not really a theory, more a description, because I've sort of come to the same view over a period of time, but it certainly describes how the economy functions, it seems to me, and how money functions. But my big concern that I raised a month ago was about simply putting money into the economy on its own. It seemed to me just wouldn't solve any problems, because all it would do, it would continue to increase the level of inequality, because basically once the rich get to the point where they're unable to spend the amount of money that they earn, they just have to carry on getting richer and richer by virtue of the law of compound interest. And if at any point in time the amount of money in the economy is finite for that moment in time, it's got to come from somewhere, and it's got to be from those that are less well off than them. So it's only if you can actually control the market mechanisms that you can stop, it seems to me at least, that happening. What you've got to say is this money can only be used for certain things. It's either got to be put directly into people's pockets, or there have to be, as you suggested, sort of tax mechanisms or some other kind of mechanism to make sure that, perhaps through universal basic services, that this extra money is put to some kind of use. Just putting money into the economy on its own is just guaranteed for it all to get hoovered up by the super rich. And I'm very persuaded by what you're saying, that yes, providing we've got a socialist agenda to go with it, it works, but on its own it won't.
Right, let me come back on those various. I mean, we're actually seeing, to some extent, some indications of this right now. If any of you are sad enough to have read Andy Haldane's speech, he's the chief economist of the Bank of England. He made a speech yesterday. Larry Elliott summarised it fairly well in The Guardian today. In fact, I recognise quite a lot of Larry's article in The Guardian today, because I seem to recognise me in some of that. Larry and I know each other quite well. We don't always agree with each other. He's somewhat to the right of me, but we know each other quite well. Andy Haldane has pointed out that people in this country are actually very pessimistic at the moment about their economic prospects, quite reasonably, because they do realise that there's an enormous risk of unemployment, and they do realise that COVID is creating all sorts of uncertainties. And yet, paradoxically, people have actually spent quite a lot in August and September. Well, that's because, of course, we actually injected a whole load of money into the economy from March to July, which people couldn't spend. In fact, the national savings of households went up significantly over those 4 months simply because people couldn't spend. And so we created money without a purpose except to keep people going and to apparently replicate the incomes they got. But in fact, because they couldn't spend it, they were actually better off for a brief period. And so they've actually now gone out and done the spending. So we have the paradox of people spending more in August and September, and at the same time believing that things are going to get very much worse. And both of those statements are true because they had more money and they believe they aren't going to have more money at the same time. So they might as well do it now. What that does imply, and exactly as you say, Vic, the point is, you can't just inject more money into the economy. And one of the things that annoys me quite a lot about people who come up and make silly comments about MMT is, well, if it's so wonderful that we can just print money without end, why do any of us bother to work? Why don't we just all live off the money we print? Because that means there won't be any food, and try as you might, doesn't look too nutritious to me. You know, it's just one of those crass comments that printing money actually has any meaning. It only has meaning if the money is used. And it only has meaning if that money, as far as I'm concerned, and I suspect as far as you're all concerned, is used for a social purpose. In other words, modern monetary theory is not an economic policy that is any way objective in the sense it's trying to be a neutral observation on society and says, oh, this is how it functions, without applying any form of normative subjective analysis as to how it should function. MMT has implicit in it, for example, the idea of a job guarantee. And the job guarantee is that everyone who wants to work should be able to work. Now that immediately says you've got to create the work for people to do if they want to work. And if the market mechanism is not delivering that, and it sure as heck isn't going to be doing that very soon in this country, you know, because as I say, unemployment is going to be skyrocketing as things go wrong and the furlough scheme ends, then it's up to the state to do it. And we're not just therefore creating money for no purpose, we're creating money for a social purpose, exactly. Making sure people are working, making sure the NHS is functioning, making sure we have an education policy that delivers, making sure we have a transport system that will sustain us as we move off carbon, and on and on and on. You cannot see MMT in isolation from the policies for which it is used. It is theoretically possible that it could be used to simply increase wealth, but actually it would not work very well because it would drive up unemployment very quickly if it was captured for that purpose by the right. I must, however, stress this one thing, which is absolutely true. And that is, I mentioned the problem with the national debt. The national debt at the moment, which is supposedly claimed to be 2 trillion, includes around 735 billion pounds, which is actually bank deposit accounts. And they are the bank deposit accounts of companies called Lloyds and Barclays and Santander and Nationwide and whatever else your preferred bank might be, who have to deposit money with the Bank of England because actually they have sold the Bank of England the gilts, the government debts, which have been resold to it. And so we have this massive pile of money, which is actually now owned by the banks and deposited with the Bank of England. The only good news about that, but it is a fundamentally good news, is the banks actually now have money. The double-edged sword is we shouldn't have to bail them out, at least, because they've got enough money to bail themselves out. It's all on deposit at the Bank of England. They're also not wasting it right now, and they're going to need it because they're going to see the most horrible degree of mortgage failures. I'm afraid that's one of the other things I'm predicting for 2021, because, of course, people who are actually forced out of work can't claim universal credit, do have a mortgage, can't claim any allowance for 9 months for a mortgage. You have to be out of work for 9 months before you can claim anything for your mortgage. And a lot of people with mortgages are going to be forced out of work, are going to default on their mortgages, and we're going to see a banking crisis. It so happens that the equivalent of QE, which is closely but not identically what MMT would propose, has happened to leave the banking sector at least in a durable position. But we should be attaching conditions again to that. I don't believe any of this comes condition free. The condition is that we are trying to build a durable, more equal, sustainable, long-term society which is just. And I frankly don't know anyone who is a real MMT advocate who doesn't buy that. Literally no one that I've seen from the right has really bought this idea, because they can't see how to make it work for the process of increasing inequality, except by money printing, which doesn't really work for them, actually. They can capture money in much easier ways than by money printing.
Maxine, as you know, we have a very light touch sharing mechanism around here, so please.
Yeah. I was agreeing with the MMT in the last meeting, and did see other people's point of view, that they felt that it would cause inequality. How do we get the Tories to, how do we pressurize them to put the money into infrastructure, which they're not doing, first of all? And secondly, do you think it would be solved by having universal basic income?
Right. How do we get the Tories to do anything? I have no idea at the moment. I mean, my own honest belief is that the Tories are not going to make it through 2021. I actually am on RT. Some people don't like RT, but I'm on RT at 9 o'clock tonight on the Alex Salmond show. And some people don't like Alex Salmond. I'm well aware of that too. And you take a risk with both RT and Alex Salmond these days, but I mean, okay, he hasn't got any charges of rape outstanding against him anymore. There are moments when you just have to, again, make compromises to make sure you get your message out there. And he's a flipping good interviewer, and he let Peter Oborne and me discuss the economy. And Peter Oborne's an odd conservative because he absolutely hates Boris Johnson, of course, which at least is one thing which is to his merit. And we were discussing what is going to happen. And he's actually more radical about the Tories than I am. But I said there are 3 crises coming up. I am out sort of answering your question, Maxine. It's there. Honestly, I've logged it. I'll get there in the end. We're just going a long way around. I told you I could speak forever. I predicted 3 crises over the next 6 months. The first is students. They are bloody angry. I don't know where Alex has gone. Are you bloody angry, Alex? Or just a bit angry?
Very angry.
Yeah, good. My sons are bloody angry at the way they're being treated right now. One is in semi-lockdown and one is in quite a lot of lockdown. And their dad's quite angry because I'm paying a contribution towards this, and I don't actually think that, frankly, we should be making a contribution. It should be as it was in 1976, which pretty much worked as far as I'm concerned. A mix of grant and, okay, parental contribution for those who were best off. And yeah, my dad did have to pay some towards my university fees, and he didn't, the miserable git. So I had to work my way through university. But yeah, that's how I learned accountancy. I literally paid for my course at university by doing accountancy. Did it the hard way, but it was fun in a strange way. But students are angry, and I think rightly so. I mean, this system has been waiting to blow up. And I think it is blowing up. And frankly, I'm waiting for students to get their act together and start protesting together on this issue. There's no point in individual halls of residence and God knows what doing it. For Christ's sake, I mean, I spent my time at NUS conference in 1977 and 1978. Is the NUS going to do something? Our local student union is going to do something? Somebody, I think, will begin to actually say this is no longer acceptable. It's too early in the term for this to have happened yet, but I believe that will be number 1 crisis. Number 2 crisis is Brexit. Come 1st of January, we have got 70-mile or longer queues for Dover, and that's food. And January is our maximum dependence on imported food month. 70% of our food is imported in January. Most of it through Dover, Calais, and it's not going to get through. We are not going to be in a pretty position. I mean, seriously, it is potentially worthwhile putting a few basics aside, just in case, I think. And I know there are budget constraints, but I've got some excess pasta, I'll be honest, and I've kept it from last time, and I'm going to keep it again because I believe it's worth it. Or stuff the pot noodles under your bed if you're a student, whatever it might be. But this is a crisis that is going to happen, and I don't know anybody who can get angrier in life than a mother who can't feed her children. I'll be blunt about it. I mean, my wife talked about this at a previous crisis, and she said, if I can't feed my children, 2008, when I knew very well what was happening in the Treasury, and I knew the development of the crisis because I was actually advising Labour at the time. I was pretty well informed about what was happening as we went into Royal Bank of Scotland melting down at that time. I knew, you know, the blows of it. And she said, if we can't feed our children, I don't care what you say, I'm stealing. My wife is a GP. It's not the standard role of a GP to go out sort of, you know, ransacking shops to feed their children, but she said she would, she didn't care. And that's literally what we could face. So, and will the Tories be able to stop that? Not a hope in hell if they can't get food on shelves. And there could be up to 5 million people unemployed who have literally got nothing to lose if their houses are on the line, whether they own those houses or whether they rent those houses. If they can't pay the mortgage and they can't pay the rent and they realise that they're going to lose their home, they have nothing left to do but protest. Put all those three together in one cauldron, add a bit of heat, and will that put some pressure on the Tories? I told you I'd come back to you, Maxine. That's where I think the pressure on the Tories comes from. Will Keir Starmer turn up the heat? God, I hope so. I mean, you know, I can sense that many of you are not exactly convinced. I mean, I think a stick of gelignite up his arse would help. That's a technical description. But, you know, because at the moment I don't see that firepower. Peter Oborne, who I'm on this programme with Alex Salmond on, who is a Tory, said he thinks there's going to be a national government next year. The last national government wasn't exactly good for Labour, as we all know. Those with, you know, studied history. Ramsay MacDonald sold himself out, and it wasn't good for Labour at all. But he believes that Keir Starmer will be leading a national government next year. Is that the case? Is that going to solve our problem? I don't know. But the reason why he believes we're going to have that is that literally the government will not have the authority to tell people to do anything. They'll be saying, we're not going to do lockdown. We're not going to do what you say because you can't feed us, you can't house us. Now, in that volatile situation, God knows what happens. And as I say, I don't really like the risks of that because people get hurt, and I'm not a revolutionary, I'm a Quaker. And so I'm afraid I sort of incline towards peaceful revolution and silent protest and, you know, passive protest rather than angry protest. But my point is that we have to get Labour to say things. Unfortunately, I see more fire in the SNP's belly than I do for these things than I do in the belly of Labour right now. And I mean, I know a lot of SNP members as well. You know, I've mentioned I've worked with Angus MacNeil quite a bit. I'm on the left. I mean, I advise some of the left of the SNP groups, particularly good think tank called Commonweal in Scotland, who are pretty radical, and whose company I like a lot. There is up there a sense of cohesion around where they're going, which we don't have. It's deeply worrying that we don't have that idea of what our social progress is. Does that mean a universal basic income? I'm still coming back to you, Maxine. I didn't make a note, but that was your other part of your question. Does that solve the problem? I've done work with an economist called Howard Reid, who actually is also an Essex guy. I was born in Romford, by the way, so I can claim to be an Essex guy. Old Church Hospital, Romford, I was born in. My mother was a nurse at Old Church Hospital, Romford, hence why I was born there. I didn't live there for long, moved to Ipswich after that. Don't ever go to Ipswich.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, that's the right thing to do to Ipswich. I promised my parents at the age of 12 that I'd leave at 18 and never go back. I recently explained to my sons that Paul Simon wrote the song My Little Town for Ipswich, particularly the line, only the dead and dying back in my little town, which is very, very unfair about Ipswich. And my brothers still live there, so I shouldn't say that. However, if you ever want to meet a town without aspiration, call it Ipswich. We need that aspiration. Does UBI solve that problem? I'm afraid I don't think it does. A, because I actually think people do want to work. I do think there is some benefit to universal basic services. I see all the reasons for making sure that people are not in poverty and do have access to services. I do believe that there is an advantage to something I call universal basic capital. No, that doesn't make me a capitalist. It means that we should support people if they want to try out new ideas. And I do actually think there's a lot of merit to giving people support to, for example, become self-sustaining on their own. I don't call that self-employment as such. This is actually just finding your own way of making a living, and I'm not opposed to that at all. But when I tried UBI with Howard Reed, who lives in Witham, sorry, Kelvedon, how dare, we modelled the economy. He's done a lot of work with the government of Wales in particular of late. And we discovered that it would need exceptionally high tax rates to make it work. Like 70% at 40,000 of income, which is not that unusual a level of income. I mean, okay, a lot of people would aspire to it, but it's not that unusual. And those levels of tax would probably have perverse effects. In particularly, they would take us so far out of international lines that there would be a lot of abuse. And we couldn't make a universal basic income that was actually going to be effective in alleviating poverty work, and with a fair tax system, we felt. So overall, we prefer the idea of a job guarantee plus universal basic services as a way of solving the problem rather than a universal basic income, because the UBI is just so distortionary of anything that we know at present that if it was to happen, it would take a very long time. And I can see why people have had problems in their experiments trying to make it work. So I'm not convinced by UBI. I tried it. You know, I'm rather like, what was his name? Sir Thomas Beecham once said, one of my lights has gone out. There are only two things in life you shouldn't try, he said, incest and country dancing. I can go a bit further than that on the things I probably won't try. I gave UBI a go. My light has come back on again. I don't know what's happening here. There's nobody else in the house. Even the dog is out for the evening. So God knows. But what I can't go there anymore. I said I'd give long answers to Vic before we started. Somebody else have a go.
Mick was trying to get in there, I saw her.
I see Mick and Charlie at the moment.
Yeah.
And Alex.
Mick,
I saw you first. Go on then. Do you want to ask three to make sure that if I actually spend 15 minutes asking this one, I've covered you all?
Why not? Yeah. So we, Mick, Charlie, and who else was it?
I saw Alex.
Sorry?
We've had one woman in the mix, thankfully, so far, but it'd be nice to have another one.
Okay. All right, I'll try and keep this quick. You've actually raised lots of things that I'm really interested in commenting on, Richard. First thing, by the way, don't apologise for insulting bankers. I worked in banks. I was only ever an IT consultant telling them they should spend more money on their systems. I was never a banker as such. And I'm actually now, I'm a student now. I'm actually taking a master's this term in history. And I think, I'm hoping that the students are going to be angry, not the fact that they're locked down and they can't get beer. They should be bloody angry about the whole commercialisation of education and the fact that they're paying at all, like you said. And I'm not sure if that's where they're going to go at the moment. That's what they should be doing. They should be having a strike against paying any sorts of fees, I believe. Yeah. But there you go. Interestingly enough, I've been reading this afternoon a history book talking about the food riots in the 18th century, which were mostly led by women breaking into baker shops and demanding their bread be sold at a reasonable price. I think you're right on song there. I think they're the ones who are going to get very angry in the new year. But I guess the two questions I've got for you, you've been saying, I think, that MMT sort of is a way to get us to full employment. And I just think, well, what is full employment going to look like? There might be a hump over the next decade if we frantically re-engineer society so that we've got sustainable systems, possibly. But beyond that, and with automation and so on, I can't imagine that there'll be even 4 days work a week for the vast majority of people in the world. And leading on from that, do you think it's possible anyway that we continue to have an economic system that relies on growth and inflation to survive? Because we're running out of resources, and we've got to get down, I believe, to a zero growth economy to survive long term. So those are my real questions: employment and growth. Yep. Your light's back on
got those. Yep. Who was next?
Was it Charlie or Alicia? I wasn't sure. Yeah.
My question is really about debt, because debt covers a lot of things. So talking about debt, deficit, national debt, public debt and private debt. You have to distinguish between all of them to get an idea. And I think indebtedness, that is public debt, is something that's a real problem, as well as private debt. So perhaps you could say something about that in terms of MMT.
I don't know what this is doing. It's bloody annoying. It's never done it before. I think the bulb is clearly getting up. I'm going to turn it off. Whoa, now it's doing all sorts of weird things. Sorry, you'll have to have a half-lit, half...
One other question other than...
Public debt, okay. And Alex?
Yeah, so...
Alex, right. Yes,
yeah. So, like, obviously, MMT sort of based upon a country with monetary sovereignty.
Yep.
So what does MMT give to people like within the Eurozone who don't have control of their own currency and spending power to spend into the economy?
Okay. A good question. I'm going to take them in roughly that order that you asked them. What is full employment? It is an excellent question, and the answer is, I don't know. I think we are going, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, nobody knows what full employment is exactly. It is giving people who want a job work. And that is full employment. The more people you give a job, it seems the more people want work. And that is the point I've made, that we're going to see 1 million or more people probably disappear from the unemployment register because they're going to realize there is no chance of getting work and there's no chance of claiming a benefit from not being in work, and therefore they're just going to disappear. So there isn't a precise figure for what full employment is, and nor is there a precise figure of how much it is at, although I would argue it's at least a living wage, and it's at least for enough hours on a living wage to ensure that a family can live on it. But, you know, frankly, we know that the real living wage is higher than anything the government describes it as, and so we obviously have to rethink what we mean by fair employment policy. Geneva, by the way, announced that its national minimum wage was £40,000 a year equivalent this week.
Well,
yeah, that's an interesting idea, isn't it?
yeah.
And apparently they can afford it, but then after all, they nick everybody else's money, so I suppose they can. It's Switzerland, after all. Also, the most boring city on earth, if ever you've had to go there, which I had to for a while, because I used to go to the United Nations on tax issues. God. The Swiss go to bed at 5 o'clock in the evening, and I'm not a nightclubber or anything else, but try to find anything open after 5 o'clock and you're just impossible. So no, I don't know precisely what full employment means, and obviously there's some people who don't want to work that many hours, and frankly there's me, who's been writing since 6:30 this morning, happily still working now, and I don't rule out might do something after we finished. And whose nominated retirement age on joining Sheffield, which I'm now doing, is 83, which apparently their computer system can't manage. I said, well, you asked me to nominate an age. I've said 83. It's your problem now. So I'm never going to retire if I can help. My will has a clause in it which says bury me with a keyboard because I might have another blog to write. I hope they realise it's a joke. So, you know, what is work, what is full employment, is really making sure that anybody who wants work can have it. And this is the essence of the job guarantee inside MMT. If somebody doesn't want to claim a job, then we've reached full employment. It's as simple as that. Will we have less work? I think the idea that if we could actually have less work and more leisure and we could move towards a 4-day week is fantastic. Mm. I mean, I know how privileged and how fortunate I've been to be able to basically be paid to do what the hell I like for the last 20 years. I mean, God knows. I once applied for a grant from the Joseph Foucher Charitable Trust, and they said, you know that a condition of this grant is that the work won't be done if we don't pay you. I said, yeah. The trouble we have is that we think you might do the work even if you're not paid. I said, yeah, but think about it this way. I said, my children will be in poverty and you're a charity, and the relief of poverty is a charitable objective. So you're giving me the grant to save them, not to pay me. And they gave me the grant. But, you know, So that is an extraordinarily fortunate thing. We also know that there are vast numbers of, frankly, rubbish jobs in the world which do not uphold people's sense of well-being. And we therefore need to address that issue and find how we can adapt to that. We also, and I entirely agree with you, need to consume less. I mean, I have a problem with the consumption of books, I admit. I brought my sons up to believe that this household has constraints on every form of consumption except books. They only have to phone me up and ask, Dad, can I have a book? And they still get one, because that's just, for me, the one thing I just don't know how to stop spending on. But everything else in life, frankly, why do we need a new iPhone every year? Why do we need, vast numbers of clothes, which frankly, I mean, this jumper is quite old. I don't care. It looks okay on Zoom, I think. Does it matter? We are over-consuming. As a society, we use too much energy, we use too many resources. It's clear we cannot continue doing that. MMT can build that in. Because when I said MMT is about literally using resources as the constraint, labor, in the sense, full employment is the constraint. We aren't saying money is the constraint, we're saying full employment is the constraint. We can also build in the idea that our literal physical resources and the extent to which we can sustain climate change is a constraint as well. And we can tax to achieve that result as we can to control inflation. And that is the way that MMT scholarship is moving. There is a fair amount of green MMT thinking going in that direction. So I believe we are moving to cover that, but I'm not quite as fast as I want. But the coincidence of MMT and Green New Deal is very high. More so in the States than here at the moment, although I am convincing more people here that it's necessary too. I'm heavily involved in Green New Deal thinking. So I hope that's okay, Mick. I'm going to move on to the question of public debt. I don't know what the problem with public debt is. We don't owe anybody any money.
No, I said all kinds of debt.
All kinds of debt is a problem.
Private debt, because people get indebted and a lot of people are actually consuming through debt.
Yes, look, I mean, private debt is a massive problem and it's going to be a cause of enormous instability. As I explained to you, as far as I'm concerned, it is a curse. And the book, The Great Estate, was very much about breaking that curse, because it is literally enslaving people. And I'm desperately worried about that. But the industry that we have to tackle before we ever get near solving the problem of debt is another industry, and that is the advertising industry. It's the only industry that is designed to, on every occasion that it operates, increase the sum of human unhappiness. After all, advertising never works unless it makes you unhappy. Yes. If I had got a brand new BMW outside, next week BMW will, I haven't, by the way, I've got a very knackered old Volvo, and it's still got several more years in it, I hope. I mean, one of my friends has just had to scrap a Volvo at 13 years old. And I said, that's deeply worrying because mine's 12 and I want to get another 8 years out of it. Yeah. Then I'll have an electric car probably. But anyway, I'm going to keep my knackered old Volvo going for as long as possible. But the moment I buy a BMW, the next thing they will do is bring out a new model to make me unhappy with the old one. That's the entire purpose of advertising, to create human dissatisfaction with your lot. So, and it's that process which then drives us to consume, which pushes us into debt, and the advertising industry and the banking industry are together designed to ensnare us in this process of endless consumption and debt enslavement. Now, I do believe that we need to control, therefore, interest rates very heavily and much more than we have. And I was involved in the campaigns, for example, against Provident Financial before it became bust and so on, but literally about doorstep debt. And that was one of my very early campaigns of literally on the ground campaigning with Church Action on Poverty on that occasion, to expose it and then begin to bring in processes which have now begun to work. But the banks are still exploiting people. Public debt is quite simply not an issue. We simply do not owe enough money to worry about. And actually the remaining public debt we've got in the form of gilts is pretty critical to make the pension system work and actually to provide security within the commercial banking system. And we haven't got a choice but have a commercial banking system for the time to come. I don't think we are going to, at the present point of time, see a non-mixed economy. We have got the balance between state and private very definitely wrong, but I personally don't see us getting rid of private altogether for a long time to come. So we do need to have some security within it, but simply public debt is a non-issue. Private debt is a massive issue, and better regulation of credit, better regulation of interest rates is the answer to that. And I believe credit controls in that sense are fundamental. And I write about those again in the book, The Courageous State. I want credit controls to limit the ability of companies to recover. One of the other things I've suggested is, for example, if we have a house price crash, which is entirely foreseeable in the next couple of years, if we have 5 million unemployed, because that will mean there will be a large number of properties going onto the market because of foreclosure, and that therefore will force down house prices, we could see negative equity coming back again, something which has happened in people's lifetimes, of course, and again is an enslavement process. And I put it on the blog yesterday saying we need to get rid of this. Oh, you should have seen the Tories pile in and tell me I'm a complete idiot. I don't understand life. You know, a house is just an asset, and if somebody's taking on an asset and they can't pay for it, that's their own personal responsibility, and the discounted value of the future payments against the value of the property which they're living in is all that they should be considering. I said, I'm talking about homes. You're talking about assets. You and I are not on the same planet. And I just said, fine, negative equity, bank's problem, not the householder's problem. If there's going to be negative equity, you wipe it out, which, by the way, is what happens in the States. So that kind of kills the argument here. So I think it's capital controls on private debt are the future direction of travel there, rather than worrying about the public debt, which is not an issue. Monetary sovereignty, you're absolutely right. Monetary sovereignty is, have you read the Stephanie Kelton on this? You have. Right, because she deals with the question of monetary sovereignty and degrees of monetary sovereignty. And this is a concept which has had to be developed over the last few years by MMT to deal with the question of how do you deal with countries, like Greece, which had zero monetary sovereignty when it was being told, basically, Yanis Varoufakis was being told by the European Central Bank, you will do what we want because we're Germany and all your debt is owed to Germany, and therefore you are now enslaved by Germany. And that is obviously a crisis. I don't believe that the EU can carry on for a lot longer within that situation. And the interesting thing is that the one agency within Europe which seems to be recognizing that it has to actually adapt and actually restore a degree of monetary sovereignty to the states who gave it up, completely in error. I mean, there should never have been a euro. I mean, Gordon Brown, if he did one thing right in his life, it was to say no to the euro. I think Gordon did more than one thing right in his life, actually. I think Gordon is actually underrated in some ways, horribly overrated in others. He was awful on tax havens, but he was good on some things. And I know Gordon a bit, not that much, but enough. But he thankfully prevented us going into the euro, which was a disaster, as it would be, by the way, if Wales, Scotland, and anybody else became independent. We need monetary sovereignty. The European Central Bank realizes there has to be a degree of monetary sovereignty now restored to the individual member states so that they have got some degree over these processes, because if it isn't restored, then there isn't sufficient of alignment between their national goals and that of the currency and that of the whole European model. So they are talking in a way that is, quite difficult to persuade the Neanderthals of Europe, who in this sense are the Netherlands and Germany, because the Netherlands is easily the most difficult state with regard to this at the present point of time, that they have got to allow the weaker states to actually have a degree of monetary sovereignty back within the constraints that the euro imposes. I eventually believe that there will be a Grexit from the euro. In other words, Germany might exit the euro, which would then make the euro a much more viable country, because there won't be the productivity differences between the countries, which drives the inequality between countries and their exchange rates at present. It is differences in productivity rates which literally gives rise to exchange rate differences over time. So there is no perfect solution to the euro, is what I answer. Nor is there a perfect solution for developing countries who don't have monetary sovereignty. But what MMT can indicate is the direction of travel in which those states should go to improve their lot without actually being able to answer everything. It doesn't solve the problem, but it does at least give you an indication as to what the policy direction should be. And that in itself is helpful, because we haven't had that before. 3 minutes to go.
I was going to say, if we've got one very quick question. If anybody wants to ask, if there's any particular burning issue, I see Alicia. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just, because I was struck by your ripping up or trying to rip up the plastic note. But what COVID has done is move us to very much a cashless society globally. And it's unlikely we'll return to that. And I was thinking about all the things that we do with cash, that like tipping people, waitresses, taxi drivers, that hidden part of the economy that gets distributed, but isn't happening so much now because everyone's going, oh, I haven't got any cash. You know? And how do you see that digitalization of money affecting MMT?
It doesn't actually make much difference to MMT, because this is not money. I hate to tell you that, but it's not money. This is a physical representation of money. Money is cancelled when a debt is extinguished. This debt is extinguished when I pay my taxes with it, but this physically exists still. So this is not the money, it is a physical representation of an IOU. And that's not the same thing, therefore. So I don't see that as being money. It is only 3% of the total money supply, although it is obviously more in terms of value of consumer transactions, but that is going down heavily. From a tax point of view, I'm actually all in favour of seeing cash disappear, because of course it means that there's much less chance of leakage. And let me be clear, a strong tax system is fundamental to MMT working, which is one of the risks of trying to use MMT in weak economies, for example, like Lebanon, just wouldn't work, because paying tax is voluntary in Lebanon, decidedly so. And actually, of course, if you're going to have macroeconomic control inside an MMT economy, you've got to guarantee you can tax to keep the equation going. So to some extent, losing cash is an advantage to MMT. And overall, the biggest cheats within the tax system are the wealthiest. They're not the person who puts the odd 10 quid in their back pocket, or the waiter who pockets a fiver of tips a day. Actually, the evidence is very strong that it's the wealthiest. So having an effective mechanism for tracing money through a digital currency is actually, frankly, to the benefit of reducing inequality to society overall. But I accept there are winners and losers in that process. But for my way of thinking, digital is going to happen whether we like it or not. People have really changed their behavior. I mean, I'm staggered that I will now pay for a coffee with a card. I never, ever thought I'd do that. I thought it was quite offensive that people did that a while ago. And now I just don't even think about it. And I believe we're all just going to get so used to it that it's just one of those things, So I think money is, the physical representation of money is going to be history soon, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for this evening. That's been absolutely, it's really started, certainly for me, to let me view modern monetary theory in a way that combines it with my socialist thoughts, because very often it's not presented in that way, it seems to me, and I'm glad that you've done that. Next month we should have Michael Roberts joining us, who's an economist who was blogging on what he then thought in 2005 was going to be the collapse of our economies, which eventually took place in 2008, and continued to go on and write all about it in The Great Recession, which is a collection of his blogs. Because I think we need to somehow bring together the socialist and Marxist elements with the modern monetary theory elements, and see where we can find common ground.